Okay. So, firstly, good morning to everyone, and thanks a lot, AP Singh sir, for joining us and sparing us time for us. Firstly, I will start introducing about our organization. Uh, so, together, WCWW, Together We Can We Will, is a non-governmental organization which was started in 2016. Together is known for the welfare of underprivileged throughout the country. As of now, we have organized programs like Cloth Donation Drive, free legal aid services, the Grand Treat or Bhandara, Diwali celebration with blinds, Children Day celebration in old age home, etc. Apart from social welfare programs, we also organize seminars, workshops, webinars, conferences, quizzes for students, mainly law students. For more information, you may visit our official website together wcww.com. Now, coming to our speaker, AP Singh sir. AP Singh sir is having experience of more than 20 years in the field of law. While he has expertise in almost every aspect of law, his area of specialization mainly encompasses three subjects that are environmental law, constitutional law, and legal philosophy. While currently holding the position of Dean of University School of Law and Legal Studies, his previous record is no less. He has served as professor for over 9 years in National Law University, Jodhpur, as professor uh, for period of 1 year with in Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia, National Law University, Lucknow, for a period of 5 years with National Law University, Jodhpur, and and is serving as professor and head for more than 4 years in Guru Gobind Singh Indraprasth University. Apart from this, he has authored various books and has written various research papers in the field of law. I think the day will fall short if I continue to mention about his achievements. So I request sir to please take over and enlighten us with his words of wisdom.
Okay. Friends, a very good morning to all of you. Taking classes for a teacher is not something new. And I'm used to taking classes for hours, and even 2-3 hours classes are something very common. So say, for example, when you teach PhD or LLM classes, then 2 to 3 hours is a normal session. So it's always, something nice to be in the classroom. But an occasion when you face or you present yourself to a wide variety of students from, say, across the country. Basically, I have been given to understand that most of the attendees in this program are students of our own university coming from various colleges. So having students from variety of colleges is always a pleasure, and talking to them is a privilege. So I take it that way. Friends, what I'm doing today, basically, I shall be talking about the idea of fundamental duties. Now, as students of law, we know that fundamental duties is part of the Constitution, but we also know that this was not actually part of the Constitution to begin with, which means that in the original Constitution, the chapter on fundamental duties did not exist. I'll come back to that, the evolution and all that. Basically, in this corona pandemic, how the duty element can help us in confronting this crisis is the fulcrum of my discussion today. That is one point. But what exactly I'm trying to do is, for which I have prepared a small PPT and I'll share it with you. I shall be mapping the idea of fundamental duties from India's traditional knowledge perspective, which means uh, as to how did we understand the idea of duty uh, in ancient India, in our traditional order, and how do we understand it today. Now, there is always a tendency to really put these things at loggerheads and treat them as something opposite to each other, as if I'm a traditionalist, I don't believe anything that is new to me or something that has happened during last 100 200 years. Or if I'm a progressivist, the ancient Indian wisdom constitutes something which is a no for me. I simply don't believe in that. My understanding is that ancient or modern, whatever we have, is something that belongs to us, and we will have to accept it wholeheartedly. Friends, there is actually no contradiction between the two. They are part of an evolutionary process. And India's genius lies in actually gathering and collecting variety of ideas over a period of, say, millenniums from all over the world. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi would put it like this, that let the wind from all sides blow through my room, but I refuse to be blown off my feet. That's how Mahatma Gandhi would talk about it. So this is all part of our history, and it is something that belongs to us today. We don't have to really despise anything that is modern. We don't have to despise anything that is old. We'll have to just accept it as it has evolved and is part of our evolutionary process. Friends, let me just share my PPT so that can you see the PPT, Ishan? No?
No, sir. You have to share screen, like in on the window.
I just okay. I know. Okay. I think now you can see the PPT. Okay.
Yes, sir. It's
So,
loading.
holding to PPT would really make our discussion slightly more systematic. Let me just move on to, instead of, you see, talking randomly about things, let me move on to the PPT. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So,
Thanks a lot.
now, this is by way of introduction, something very simple. We know it, that the kind of a pandemic that we are facing today, it has really changed the whole existence as we understand it. And the depth and comprehensiveness of the impact of this crisis is something that will take a bit of time. You see, it is still to be determined as to what we have gained, what we have lost, and what is the impact. To be very true, every part of our life process, either you talk in terms of individual life process, you talk in terms of community or society perspective, or you talk in terms of institutional behavior, you see, almost everything has got disrupted. Institutional goals have got changed. I just give a small example. During last 2 days, we were brainstorming on banking laws. So say pre-corona phase, we had RBI talking about, by way of that monetary policy committee, targeting inflation. This was 3 months back. So they will do everything to really control this inflationary process. But today, 2-3 months later, the RBI is talking about deficit financing or monetizing the deficit, which means printing the currency and distributing it to increase liquidity in the market. So look, within 2 months, how the goals of the institutional system has got changed. The whole economic activity, the whole chain, supply chains and all that have got disrupted. But I'm an optimist, and I believe that today we apparently are more equipped to face this crisis than ever before. I believe if somebody, I mean, I must have been a very small child at that point of time, we faced famine or a pandemic type of a crisis in 1966-67. And the amount of embarrassment as a community we had to face by concluding agreements like PL 480 with US is something that people of my generation, you see, they remember it. Obviously, I was a very small child at that point of time, so I don't remember. But we read in history that we as a country had to face a lot of embarrassment because of that PL 480. The only point that I can quote here is when Eisenhower, it was Eisenhower, no, this was a foreign secretary at that point of time, just forgetting his name, American fellow. When he was flying to Delhi, he made a statement at New York airport that the grains in our granaries is a potential weapon to dominate the world. So he was coming to India, you see, and we had to really enter into that agreement because we had to feed millions. At that point of time, I had no grains in our granaries. So we had a lot of such crises at other times as well. 1943, we had a famine and a lot of people were wiped out. But those were the days when we were not really equipped to handle all those things. We, as a young nation, the nation that belongs to youngsters, in fact, need to remember that today we have a lot of assets whereby we can really change this crisis into an opportunity. So, just for the purpose of reminding ourselves, we are the youngest country in the world, the average age being of roughly 30 years or something, 29 point something. So this bubbling energy, obviously, we are not able to use it properly. We have a wonderful, vibrant media. We have matured set of democratic institutions and a lot of, you see, traditions of a very awakened community. And above all, we have a very supportive international environment. Despite the fact, the kind of problems we are facing in the neighborhood, where Nepal is creating troubles, where Pakistan keeps on creating troubles, where China is also now putting its nose, we is still in a very, very strong position as far as international credit of India is concerned. So we have, you see, a lot of international, supportive international environment at the moment with us. And in fact, if we can really use all this, then this can really change the course of history. Having talked about this introductory element, which is something every one of us knows, let me move on to the idea of duties, friends. Now, before I move on to the idea of duties, let me explain, okay, that you see, when we talk about, there is something what we call viewpoint, and there is something what we call a standpoint. These two things taken together, in fact, constitutes the ideology and the goalposts of a community. This is how we understand it. And obviously, these also determine the course of our history. This is something very general. But we need to understand the difference between viewpoints and standpoints. Now, we need to understand it that standpoints are more important for us than viewpoints, because it is the standpoints that determine my viewpoint. I'll give you an example. So say, for example, suppose I'm facing east. I'm not sure which side I'm facing and which side you are facing, but suppose I'm facing east. And the screen that I have, the computer or the laptop that I have through which I'm interacting with you, lies east to me. Somebody in front of me might say, no, sir, the laptop lies west to me. Both of us are true. So what's the difference between the two? The difference of a standpoint, which is determining my viewpoint. So to me, this appears to be east to me. For the person sitting in front of me, the laptop appears to be lying west to him. So the point is this, that variety of standpoints of civilizational systems, they actually have a very different way of looking at things. So looking at the idea of duty also has its own, own own way of looking at it. So we as Indians look at duty from a very different perspective from the way Westerners would look at it. This is something that we need to understand at the you see initial stage itself. Now, going back to the idea of duty, duty is considered to be the English translation of kartabya, but they are very different in fact. I shall talk about the structure of duty as well, but let me just talk about this. Kartavya, where, I mean, this is something which should be done. So kartabya in a particular context. My position, my status endows me or expects me to do a certain thing. So say for example, as a teacher, I need to deliver knowledge. As a father, I need to take care of my kids. And as a citizen, I need to do several things. Now, this is what I should be doing. So that is my kartabya. That's how we understand it. What should I do actually depends on where do I stand. So generally we say that this is my duty is depend on my karma, and my karma depends on my dharma. Now these are the things that are very complicated issues which I will not refer here, but I just wanted to explain that these three things, like duty, karma and dharma, they are actually interrelated. Okay, this is one point. Now I shall be taking resort to Bhagavad Gita. In fact, we have a huge amount of ancient literature from Ved, Upanishads to Smritis and Purans and several other things. But Bhagavad Gita is said to be a very simplified version of that very complicated knowledge process that we had in the ancient ages. So we actually in our tradition, we call this a Lokikrat version of that complicated knowledge that that exists in the form of Vedic knowledge. So I shall be looking at this say simplified version of our traditional understanding of the world as such. Now this is something that probably you may be knowing, but just for the purpose of sort of briefing you, Gita talks about three types of duties, or one can say yoga, though it's a different kind of an understanding, but we say that it is a book that talks about karma yoga, bhakti yoga and jnana yoga. And karma yoga is said to be the dominant element of Bhagavad Gita. If you read Lokmanya Bal Gangadhar Tilak's commentary on Bhagavad Gita, then actually the name of the book is Gita Rahasyam, and in fact the whole idea that he discusses in first 600 pages, actually this book is divisible into two portions. The first portion, consisting of roughly 650 pages, is a commentary of what Bhagavad Gita is all about, and then he moves on to the rest of the book, running into roughly 400 pages. He talks about the commentary slok by slok. That is the way the whole book has been written. So the first part of this book actually seeks to establish this idea that basically the Gita is a matter of karma yoga. It's a book of karma yoga, so to say. Now, just try to understand this. I have taken a few, not many, but a few sloks from Bhagavad Gita. So at one place, this is chapter 3, slok 5. And all, I mean, these are all sloks from chapter 3, and there are some other sloks as well. So Lord Krishna writes it, Nahi kakshanamapi jatu tishtatya akarmakrit karyate hyavasah karmah sarvah prakritir jaigunai. He says that in this, I mean, the rough translation of the whole thing would be that anything in this world, anything that is tangible, even for a small moment, nahi kastik shramapi jatu tishtatya akarmakrit. There is nothing in this world which even for a moment actually remains static without doing a karma. In fact, everything works, keep on working as if somebody is actually forcing it to do something. कार्यते ह्यवसः कर्मः सर्वः प्रकृति जय गुणै. अपने प्रकृति जन्य कारणों से, गुणों से everybody is forced to do something. So therefore, even when you are sitting static, something is happening. Though it may be in the category of akarma, but nevertheless the karma is happening. So that is the point, that everything in this world is actually doing some or the other thing every point of time. It is never static. It is never in a position where it doesn't do anything. You keep on doing things. And then he talks about what he talks about the Yagya Chakra. So the whole cosmic process is considered to be some kind of a cyclical process, wherein every person being part of that cycle actually needs to do or perform a certain duty. I talked about kartabya, that my kartabya is determined by my status and position. So in that cycle, I am endowed with certain or some duties are actually obligatory on me that I need to perform because I stand in that particular thing. So therefore, in chapter 3 itself, he talks about that if you perform your karma or your duty by being part of this Yagya Chakra, I'll come back to that slightly later as to what this Yagya Chakra is all about, then it does not bind you. It really becomes a sort of play of life process. Tadarth karma konteya mukta sangha samachara. Now, so why one should do one's duty? Lord Krishna talks about that he being the Almighty, so to say, the representation of Almighty. In fact, all of us in a sense are the manifestation of that Almighty. So, but nevertheless, we consider him to be some kind of a, incarnation. So he says that name parthaste kartavyam trishu lokeshu kinchana nan vaptam avaptavyam varta evacha karmani. The idea is, he says that he addresses Arjun, says that in these three lok there is nothing that is not available to me. So everything is available to me. Nevertheless, every moment of time I will have to perform a certain duty. Though everything is available to me, but I need to keep on doing my duty. And why we do duty is something he explains in another slok of Bhagavad Gita, wherein he says that earlier we have seen that everyone has to keep on working, in fact is forced by his natural tendencies to keep on working, and nobody is static, nobody is in a position of not doing anything. But those who stand in the capacity of a leader, they simply do not do their duty for the purpose of doing their duty, for the purpose of doing their karma. Rather, yat pramanam sakurte lokas tadanuvartate. The whole slok that I have written, and you can read it, yadyadacharati shrestah tattad deve tarojanah yat pramanam sakurte lokas tadanuvartate. Meaning thereby that those who stand in the capacity of a leader, they also work like any commoner. But by their work, they create a praman, they create a precedent, which is followed by the rest of the flock. Okay. Now, friends, this way, if you understand, then the idea of duty in Indian tradition is the backbone of one's existence, because you have to keep on working. Your status, your position actually obligates you to perform certain set of duties, certain kartabya, which you need to keep on doing. In fact, every person And you see, like there's a bit of a difference. I talked about viewpoint and standpoint. If you look at the creation from Western perspective, then they talk about something we call uh, tabula rasa, that every person is born as a clean slate and you can write anything on that. Indian tradition does not believe in that. Indian tradition believes that a person born in this birth is not a stand-alone entity, is not a stand-alone birth as such. It is part of a long chain, and every person born carries with him 5 types of debts, rin, debts. So we talk about 5 rin that we will have to just you see, repay. So there is a dev rin, there's a rishi rin, there's a pitra rin, there's a manushya rin, there's a bhut rin. So these are slightly complicated ideas, but the point is that nobody is a stand-alone entity. He is born as part of a long chain, and therefore it is his duty to be within, because in this chain he stands a certain capacity at a certain place, status, position. According to that position, he has a certain duty to perform, and these duties he has to keep on performing. And what kind of a duties we need to perform is, because this is what like I have another 2 points. Astadash Puraneshu Vyasasnadvayam Paropkarah Punyaya Papaya Paripidanam, which means that the whole existence is for the purpose of doing good for others. If you are not doing good for others, then this entire existence means nothing. And therefore, the Indian tradition establishes a sort of ideal in this shlok, which Mahatma Gandhi would talk in terms of his theory of concentric circles. Those who have studied a bit of Gandhi might recall his theory of concentric circles, where he talks about that an individual should sacrifice himself for the family, family for the community, community for like that. So this is what is written, you see, in one of the shloks, Tyajedekam kulasyarthe, gramasyarthe kulam tyajit, gramam janapadasyaarthe, hyatmarthe pratim tyajit, which means that one should sacrifice oneself for the family can be sacrificed for the community, and then everything can be sacrificed for the purpose of Hyatmarthe Prithvim Tyajit. It's Atmarth means for the welfare of the whole humanity. Even you can, I mean, you can sacrifice everything. Now, the whole Indian mythos for that purpose, if you talk in terms of Indian mythos, the concluding element would be that one needs to do one's duty, and rest of the things have got to be left into the hands of the God. This is what Bhagavad Gita talks about. Karmanyevadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. The simple idea is, without getting into the philosophy, that you need to keep on working and concentrate on your karma, because if you start concentrating on the idea of its result, then the quality of karma goes down. Now, I just take Dr. Radhakrishnan's idea of how he seeks to summarize the idea of duty. He says, duties are the opportunities offered to a man to sink his separate self and grow into the world. This you can appreciate and understand, that I personally, without that collectivity around me that gives me meaning, I as an individuality doesn't mean anything. This, I mean, in Aristotelian definition, he talked about that man being a gregarious animal, if he lives beyond the community, then he is either a beast or a god. So if you call yourself a human, you need to be in some kind of a community, collectivity. So this is Dr. Radhakrishnan is talking about, that duties are the opportunities offered to man to sink his separate self into that community and grow into the world. In fact, it is the element of duty that makes the life of a community possible. I just try to explain a bit of duty from other perspectives as well, which might explain the idea of duty in that I had tried to explain from the Bhagavad Gita perspective as well. So this is something which Mahatma Gandhi's perspective. This is 1947, late 1947, maybe November, December or something. You might be knowing that in 1945, United Nations was established in 1945, and 1948 we had Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt was the chairperson of this committee who was drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, Mahatma Gandhi was already a very famous personality during those days, and is a spiritual person, obviously. So Eleanor Roosevelt decided that we should send a draft of Universal Declaration of Human Rights to Mahatma Gandhi. This draft was sent to him, and he returned the draft by writing 1.5 line on that draft. Now, this is what that 1.5 line was that I am writing here. This is what Gandhi wrote. I have learnt it from my illiterate but wise mother that the best of rights flow from a duty well performed. If I am able to perform my duty properly, it is from that duty, performance of the duty, that the idea of my right would emerge. Right does not have, according to Indian understanding, right does not have a separate existence, independent of duty. In fact, the idea of right flows from the duty. And even from current perspective, no right can be complete without an element of duty. There are a lot of examples that I can quote, but I just talk about a few incidents. When 50 years of Universal Declaration of Rights were completed, then United Nations actually adopted that Valencia Declaration of Responsibilities and Duties in 1998. In fact, if you look at the UDHR that we have at the moment, within UDHR, you have two types of, duties talked about. They are actually part of the statement of rights itself, just as in fundamental rights under Indian Constitution, we have a statement of rights and then the statement of limitations. So say, for example, take Article 19. It talks about from Article 19(1)(a) to 19(1)(f), talking about variety of rights, right to free speech and expression, of association, of movement and property, and several other things. And then from clause 2 to 6, it talks about the grounds on which these rights can be restricted. So these restrictions are actually the sort of a sort of restraint on the individual. So one could talk in terms of, though it is not a statement of duty, but in an exact frame, you have the element of duty embedded in the UDHR itself. One can read, for example, Article 29, I remember, wherein the duty expression has been used specifically in UDHR. One can look into that. The point that I'm trying to make is very simple, that without an element of duty, the element of right cannot exist as such. Right cannot really exist independent of duty. Please remember this, that there is a difference between duty and obligation. Obligation is a self-generated element. So say, for example, the whole of English law on contract is actually a law of obligation. So I enter into a contract with XYZ, and thereby certain obligations are created. Duty, on the contrary, is actually inherent in my existence. My existence, a certain position in the system, actually obligates me to perform certain duties. So duties is not something that I have generated, that I have created out of my own sweet will. Though in the dictionaries, these expressions are used almost synonymously, but if you read, for example, HLA Hart. HLA Hart has talked about, you see, duty and obligation as to how they are different from each other. But the point is this, that duty is the core value of human existence that makes the life of an individual or the community meaningful in any way. Please understand this. I'll come back to that slightly later. That individual and the collectivity, individual and the community, they have their own separate existence. They have their own character. They have their own destiny. And they, I mean, in Indian tradition, we call it Vyasti and Samasti. So the idea of an individual, his life, his existence, his destiny, whatever you call it, his bhagya, karma, whatever you call it, is called Vyasti. And similarly, something that we call collectivity also has a personality, a destiny, a character, all those things. So individual or community life, to make it meaningful in any way, the element of duty is something which is at the core of our existence. Now, slight distinction, as I talked about in the beginning, you see the standpoint and viewpoint. Here, a bit of a idea you can get as to how Indian tradition looks at duty and how the Western perspective is slightly different from that. Nevertheless, when we started with our constitution, this is part of our learning that students of law are actually obligated to learn, that when we launched our constitution, then at that point of time, the set of institutions that we had, they were all, you see, Western institutions, which were actually established and nurtured during last 200 years. And the whole this entire thing was obviously generated by the Britishers for the purpose of their cultural, the project of their cultural imperialism. This is something which is part of our history. Don't have to explain it in a big way. At that point of time, the idea was that if we try to bring in a lot of ancient traditions into our administrative processes, then probably it might disrupt the existing institutional mechanism. So therefore, at that point of time, the wisdom was that let us continue with the system as it is, and we slowly try to incorporate the indigenous ideas and indigenous thinking into our institutional mechanism. Because at that point of time, changing the whole thing would have cost enormously, because the disruptions would have been there. So we did not want to have these disruptions. So the idea of duty, as I have explained earlier, the idea of duty was therefore not actually made part of the constitution. Now, it's not that there was nobody to really talk about duties at that point of time. In fact, P.V. Kane, who has written a 5-volume big book, you see, The History of Dharma Shastras, who was one of a very accomplished thinkers on Indian philosophy, he was there in 1950s, and he had criticized the Indian constitution only on this ground, that the constitution talks only about rights and not duties. And he tried to explain, and is available, these things are available in his book on the history of Dharma Shastras, wherein he talks about as to how Indian collective, the collectivity that is India, that we have constituted, you see, in Article 1 as India, that is Bharat shall be the Union of States. So he talked about that this collectivity is basically a duty-based entity. So duty element is at the core of our existence, and not talking about duty is going to distort the whole system. This is what P.V. Kane talked about. There are a lot of articles during those days that he wrote, criticizing the Indian Constitution for not involving the element of duty in its basic draft. Nevertheless, uh, nevertheless, we continued with the Constitution. Okay. If you look at the part of duties in the Western thinking, they are not part of the constitutions. I have already talked about it. Socialist constitutions do have, the chapters on fundamental duties. China, for that purpose, has it. Sri Lanka is not a communist country, but Sri Lanka also has a chapter on fundamental duties in their constitution. In fact, at that point of time, probably, and this is something that we have in some of the Indian Law Institute journals as well in 1956-57, that at that point of time, the idea was that the idea of duty could be integrated by way of a judicial interpretation, or even the constitutional scheme could have been changed, and it could come by way of a restrictions, by the state system. So that was, and Hofeld's right duty paradigm is something that is part of our legal learning, wherein he talks about the duty actually can be embedded by way of a legal mechanism, obviously, in the element of right itself. So the thinking was there, but the idea was not incorporated into the constitution. Later on, there was a realization, and you have in 1970s and 1980s, there are some cases in US Supreme Court as well, which have talked about, or rather have incorporated the element of duty in their in the idea of rights. So say, for example, if you look at the US Constitution, for example, so they have Bill of Rights, the first 14 amendments, Bill of Rights. There you don't have an element of duty, but in these two cases, Reynolds versus US, which is a 1970 judgment, and Dennis versus US, which is another 10 years, I think, 1980 judgment, which the US Supreme Court is trying to say that your availability of your right is dependent on performance of your duty, and that non-performance of your duty might affect the availability of your right. That is the way US Supreme Court does it in 1970s, 80s. But please remember that these are 200 years later, because US Constitution was designed way back in 1780s. 1780s. So 1789 is what you see. You have US Constitution finalized. The 14 amendments that we have in terms of Bill of Rights came 4-5 years later, 1793. So in that constitution, we don't have the idea of duty incorporated, exactly like Indian Constitution. But later on, they have also incorporated this idea. In 1970s, probably a rethinking happened, and Swaran Singh Committee actually presented a report whereby by 42nd Amendment, we incorporated a separate chapter under Article 51A, Chapter 4A, wherein we had incorporated 10 duties to begin with. 11th duty has been incorporated later on by way of 86th Constitutional Amendment. That is something which is part of our learning. But what we need to understand is that they are actually more or less like directive principle state policy, which are not enforceable like fundamental rights. So we call them non-self-executory provisions of the Constitution, which are not executed, in their own way, in their own independent existence. They have got to be incorporated into the idea of rights by way of a constitutional interpretation. So say, for example, if you recall Justice Subba Rao's judgment in Golaknath, wherein he said like this is a change the environment, because in Champakam Dorai Rajan, the idea of the Supreme Court was that when there is a clash between fundamental rights and directive principles, the fundamental rights would prevail, because directive principles are non-justiciable rights. They cannot be implemented in a court of law. So they need to be incorporated into the fundamental rights by way of some action, judicial interpretation or legal action. So in Subbarao's judgment in Golaknath talks about this fallacy that they can really there can be a clash between fundamental rights and directive principles. This fallacy was actually disrupted in Golaknath's case, and Justice Subbarao writes this, that the fundamental right derives their life breath from directive principle state policy, which means that for the purpose of interpreting fundamental rights, you will have to interpret directive principles along with them, and have to provide the contents of the fundamental rights would come from directive principles. Fundamental duties will also be incorporated somehow into the fundamental rights as such, by way of a judicial interpretation process. There are, if you look into your constitutional text, you will have several, I mean, dozens of judgments we have. But I have that dancing girl case from the state of Uttar Pradesh, Noor Muhammad versus Jiauddin. It's a very simple case in which there was this marriage party, and you know that along with that marriage party, there was a troupe having a dancing girl as well. So the two sides, the bridegroom side and the bride side, there was some dispute between the two with reference to the payment to that dancing girl. And the troupe, that was orchestra party they may have with the you see that barat or that marriage party. So and the dispute got so bad that the two sides really fought pitched battles. And so what happened was that the bridegroom came back without getting the girl married. They came back. So Bharat came back. Nothing happened. And then they demanded that, you see, we spent so much of money, and because of there were cross suits, in fact. Somebody said, I have spent so much of money, and because the other person committed a mistake, so therefore I had to I need to be repaid this much of money. Now Supreme Court, because bridegroom's side actually has claimed a certain hefty amount of money, that much of money I have lost in the process because of the mistake done by the bride side. So the Supreme Court had interpreted fundamental duties in this context, and said, because one of the fundamental duties in 51A is to respect womanhood, and by not marrying that girl, you have disrespected the womanhood, and therefore your right to claim that damage is not available to you. This is one simple case. There are several other cases. In fact, I recall another judgment from Rajasthan High Court. This judgment was in 1989, in fact, wherein Supreme Court actually interpreted the duty, to protect the environment, because in 51AG we have this duty to protect the environment and the natural, the natural world, and develop compassion towards all living beings. That is the kind of a duty we have in 51A G small. So this was interpreted by the Supreme Court with Article 21 and Article 48, and Supreme Court said that it is not your right but a duty to protect your environment. You see, because we keep on talking about right to pollution-free environment. Supreme Court, in the High Court of Rajasthan, interpreted as not duty, not right, but a duty to protect the environment. So, interrelationship. So this is the way the duties have been incorporated. We need to understand it, that they are non-self-executory provisions of the Indian Constitution. For the purpose of executing them, they have got to be interpreted with other provisions which are executory in character. So executory in character are fundamental rights, and therefore they have to be interpreted with the fundamental rights. This is a long tradition from Champakam Durai Rajan to Maneka Gandhi that we need to understand separately. Now, this is just a list of what we have under the Constitution: abide by the Constitution and respected ideals, institutions, the national flag and the national anthem. There's just a list that we have in the fundamental duties. I think you have it. I don't have to repeat everything. Uphold and protect the sovereignty, unity, and integrity of India, to defend the country and nation and render national service, promote harmony and a spirit of common brotherhood among all people of India, several other things. Protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. There is this respecting womanhood as well somewhere. Develop the scientific temper, humanism, and spirit of inquiry. All these things are there. Okay. And this last one is added by way of 86th Amendment to provide opportunities for education by the parent and the guardians to their child and ward between the age of 6 to 14 years. This is something that has been added. It's the 11th duty. So initially we had 10 in 42nd Amendment. 86th Amendment has added one more duty. Okay. Now this is something which is part of your constitution. I need not really explain them or elaborate them. Now, here I will take a bit of time. There are 2 slides, in fact, in terms of my concluding remarks, wherein I try to really explain this idea. So, nowhere I had tried to, present the points whereby you can say that there is some kind of a clash between what is old and what is new. Fundamental duties actually represent something which is typical. Some people say that they have been taken from Soviet system. But then if you look at the chapter of this Russian Constitution, then you will appreciate that the idea of fundamental duties under Indian Constitution is very different. I'll tell you a small story that would probably explain my standpoint as to how the things that we have in terms of Indian Constitution, they might appear to be appear to have been taken from here and there, but they are typically Indian. Fundamental duties particularly I'm talking about. So the story I have taken is from Pandit Nehru's Discovery of India. So he talks about this story. I'll explain that story. It'll take 2-3 minutes. I hope I have another 5-7 minutes. Ishan?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So I just take 5-7 minutes to conclude this. The story is from Discovery of India. This there was a king, a very cruel king. So when you have a cruel king, you obviously would have rebels as well. So what happens that there was a friend of this king who was a businessman who will do business across the globe and will and brings a lot of wealth to the king. He does business for himself and for the king as well. Now, what happens in one of such journeys that he had abroad, the ship got sunk and the businessman also perished along with the ship. Now, this news reaches the king that the ship that was bringing a lot of wealth to you has got sunk. How the ship got sunk? Well, the businessman was the captain, so it must have been because of his mistake. But what can he do? Because the businessman is dead. So somebody in the court of that king suggested that, sir, okay, doesn't matter if the businessman is gone, that doesn't matter. You can actually take the money from the wealth that he has left, which means that you can confiscate his property to recover the loss that has occurred to you because of the sinking of the ship. This was the kind of a suggestion that a member of the so this was something the king liked the idea that okay, my money got lost because of the mistake by that because of the mistake of the businessman, so I will confiscate that businessman's property to repay my loss, to recoup my loss. Now there must have been somebody faithful to that businessman, so he rushed to the house of this businessman. This businessman is survived by a wife and a young daughter. So he rushed to the house of that businessman and alerted the bereaved wife and the daughter that, look, you have lost your husband, that is fine, but the problem is that your property may also be confiscated and you may also suffer enormously. So better you leave this place. Now where to go? Because the king's guards would be there everywhere. So that typical story whereby the person takes them by some secret tunnel to some jungle far away from the place where the king is there, and he leaves this mother and the daughter duo in a jungle to fend for themselves. Obviously he saved their life, that is the only thing. Now this mother and daughter, they are very thirsty and hungry and nothing to eat and huge heat over there. So they are now sitting under a tree, just thinking as to how do we manage to have something for eating, for drinking water or something. So they listen to the groans of a man. Somebody is groaning. Now they just look around, say, who's this person who's groaning? So they find that there is a person who has been beaten black and blue and has been hung over a tree to die a slow death. Who's this person? So the mother and the daughter, they forget their own problems, and then they move on to this person and asking who you are and how can we help you. Now this person who is hung over a tree and may die any moment now, because he is already crippled and nothing to eat and all that. So he says that you can help me by making your daughter marry me. This is something very outrageous. This person is going to die and asking the girl in marriage. But then they simply didn't understand anything, and crisis situation. So they agreed that okay, the mother agreed that okay, I will marry my daughter to you. Now tell us, how can we help ourselves? So he said, he just indicated towards a tree and said that dug up the earth, dig the earth, and then there are three money. You understand? There was something some blessed serpents would have money with them. So the three monies are there of a very different character, which emit a lot of light, some kind of a very precious jewel kind of a thing. So there are three monies in that, and what he says is that you take these three monies, go to a particular place. He tells them the story is long. I'm just cutting it short. So he says that you go to a particular place, and this the girl will find a Brahmin boy, will have a child from him. One that he will have a boy, you see, child from that Brahmin boy. One money is to be given to that Brahmin boy. The one money is to be tied around the neck of this child, and this child is to be left around a particular place, around a river or something. And the third money is to be kept by the mother, not the daughter, the businessman's wife. This is how the three monies are to be utilized. Okay, this is one part of the story. The story actually starts from this, that a young king goes to a pond to perform Shraddh, Tarpan. So when the Purohit actually performs that Shraddh and Tarpan and offers something, three hands come up from that sarovar to claim that Tarpan. It's something like one hand should come up because a person can have only one father. That is the kind of story. So the Purohit tries to understand as to why these three hands are coming up. There should be one hand only to receive the Tarpan. So he says that okay, he chants some mantra and then he Tarpan thing. So an old lady seeks to stop him in his way, saying, stop, listen to me. So he is irritated and says, okay, you don't have to stop me and let me go to my place and all that. So the lady says, shall you not listen the story of those three hands? The king was surprised as to why this lady should be knowing about the three hands. So then the old lady opened his hand. She had a money in her hand, and the money was exactly like the one that was tied around the neck of that king. So the fellow was slightly surprised that why this lady should be having a money like I have been, tied around my neck. And then this story goes in the background. The lady is actually the wife of the businessman. The mother having died, the daughter having died after giving birth to a child. The child is left around the river. The king who did not have, the neighboring king who didn't have the child, he takes up that child and brings him up. And this finally becomes this king who has come to the Sarovar to perform the Tarpan. Now, Pandit Nehru asked this question, who is entitled to be the father of this boy? There are three fathers basically here. One is the father to whom his mother was legally married, the rebel who was who died, you see, while he was hung on the tree, to whom the wife was married. This daughter was married. The other was his biological father, the Brahmin boy, biological father. And third was the father who brought him up. So these are the three hands that are actually claiming his Tarpan. That is the story Pandit Nehru talks about. And then he asks, and anybody can ask this question today, who is the rightful father of Tarpan or Shraddh? And Pandit Nehru answers this. Who has given him the purpose of life? In the sense, this king will fight the that cruel king who had confiscated the property, had made this family a destitute, and has not really, performed the role of a friend to a friend who would bring a lot of money to him. So this is the he is the rightful father. Now, this story is to be understood from the point of view of Indian Constitution as to what exactly is uh, this constitution. Does it belong to us? Its biological body may have been derived from anywhere. I mean, it may have several things taken from here and there, but the very purpose, the typical purpose of an Indian is explained by by this constitution. So it doesn't matter that its body was derived from somewhere else, but the very you see the purpose of this collectivity called India that is Bharat, actually is all decided, all determined, all put together in this constitution. And therefore, this constitution and this idea of the fundamental duties is something which is very typically Indian. Friends, before I just move on, I'll take another 3-4 minutes. When I talk about and give a lot of emphasis on the element of duty, this does not mean that the idea of right is not important for us. In fact, the idea of rights is something which actually is a very easy way to constrain the powerful, in the sense that you have given rights to individuals in the country, and then they are limitations on the powerful state system. So rights actually help you in fighting the powerful if he tends to become cruel, right? So rights is that kind of a thing. Right is also important, but the point is that overemphasis on the idea of rights has actually distorted our system, has played havoc with our system. Therefore, the element of duty has got to be combined with it. This is what I'm trying to say, that we will have to balance this right and duty paradigm and brace up ourselves at the level of the community to meet the challenges of an unprecedented public health crisis. We need to remember John F. Kennedy, who, you see, responding to his Secretary George Sorensen, has said, and it is quoted everywhere, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That is the kind of an idea we will have to, cultivate. And please remember, you cannot change the direction of the wind. Wind will blow in its own way. But you can certainly adjust your sails of your ship to reach your destination. That is something we need to understand, friends. Therefore, I would finish with this, that we will have to take a pledge to abide by the constitutional ideals and fundamental duties. They constitute the core of the whole idea of our collective existence. In fact, I call them the goal posts of our collective life process as Indians. This is something that represents our ideals that have been nurtured and nourished by the by you see by several generations of our forefathers, and these ideas continue to inspire generations even today. Friends, if we can incorporate these ideals in our own way of life, then probably we can really, achieve that glory that Article 1 of Indian Constitution talks about, that India, that is Bharat, shall be the union of states. Let me just conclude by saying that the kind of a community that we are going to have, the samasti that I talked about in the beginning, if I mean the glorious future that we will have, will be directly proportional to the efforts we would make in incorporating the ideals that Indian Constitution has incorporated in fundamental duties. This will make the life of the individual and the collectivity called India meaningful in some ways. This is what I would like to conclude. I hope that it might generate some debate and questions that I would look ahead to answer. Ishan, it is over to you. If there are questions, I would be extremely happy to attempt an
Yes, sir.
answer for that. Please.
Thanks a lot, sir. It was really informative session. Guys, I would request if there is any questions you can ask through live chat. I saw a variety of questions during the presentation. If there are any questions left, you can
In
just.
fact, there are 99 chats, but how many
Yes,
questions I don't know.
yes, sir. Sir,
Uh,
there is one question. Fundamental duties, political obligation, or moral
no,
obligation?
okay. We'll take, like, there is Shyam Narayan Choksi, Union of
Yes, sir.
India. Okay, this is okay.
Okay,
Uh,
first I read the question, sir, so that it gets to everyone. Yes, the judgment of Sham Narayan Choksi versus Union of India is contrary to the judgment of Vijoy Emmanuel versus State of Kerala, para 9 and 10. He wants explanation on it.
you see, I don't think that there is a contradiction between Shyam Narayan Choksi and Vijay Emmanuel. Vijay Emmanuel said that if you just, you see, keep on standing and paying respect, then you are committing no, you see, no offense, and there is no disrespect shown to the national flag. Shyam Narayan Choksi talks about that when this national flag is, that national anthem is sung, then you need to stand up and pay respect to it. It doesn't say that you have to sing it. Actually, this is the idea of duty that we need to understand, that it it is not actually a static idea. It keeps on evolving. Uh, Vijay Emmanuel was a very different context altogether. And if you look at the traditions of what is the name of that community, uh, which you see, they say that we cannot really bow before any tangible entity. Jehovah's community. Jehovah's community. So I mean, because it is part of their religious tradition that they cannot really bow before a tangible object. So if the child is standing and paying respect and not singing the national anthem, it doesn't matter. Shyam Choksi also just talks about paying respect to the national anthem, a different context altogether. So if you read it together, uh, to my understanding, there is no contradiction between the two. And if you think that there's a contradiction, then one can actually say that Vijay Emmanuel has been partially overruled. Though I don't look at it from that perspective, I consider both the judgments correct, you see, and they are complementary to each other.
Okay, thanks a lot, sir. I think that sufficiently explains this question. If there are any other question, please just write it over on the live chat. Sir will surely answer it.
Fundamental, there are a lot of questions I see. Fundamental duties is political obligation or moral obligation. They are both, my friend. In fact, you see, there are several classifications of duties. Like there can be natural duties, there can be political duties, there can be societal duties. So there are several things. But as far as the element of duty is concerned, and the way fundamental duties have been talked about, they are both uh, uh, what is that? Political obligation and moral obligation. Uh, the idea of duty has got to be understood in its holistic sense of the term. If we really talk about, you see, duties in parts, then probably the very idea of duty, you see, will not really be very clear to us. So duty, the element of duty has got to be understood in its holistic sense of the term. There shall not be a categorization like political duty separately and moral duty separately, though for academic purposes we talk about, but then the fundamental duty chapter that we have, they are both political and moral obligations. For example, um, political, what I can just look into the things whereby you can classify some of the duties which are moral duties explicitly, and you can categorize some duties out of it which are political duties. So they are a complete list of duties that a citizen is expected to perform, not necessarily that they should be classified separately. For the purpose of academic discussion, we can do it, but otherwise they are combined or a holistic idea of duties as such for individual's life process.
Okay, sir. So we'll take up last question because there are a variety of questions being asked. So we'll take up last question and then we'll end. So maybe we can ask yeah, there's one question. How fundamental duty can change in this pandemic situation? So, sir, I
You
guess he needs to ask that fundamental
I'm getting your point.
duty.
I'm getting
Yes,
your
sir.
point. Just think about it. Articulating a right in the absence of a duty. So you see, I expect that my health would be taken care of by the public authority without me as an individual doing anything for the purpose of helping the community. Now you can just see as to what has happened during last 2-3 months. Do I mean if everybody would have performed his duties properly, the employer, the the community as such, why the laborers should have really traveled thousands of kilometers, hungry and thirsty, some people dying in the process? It's only because some people did not perform their duty. They did not pay them their dues, and people were not walking on the streets. There were villages and cities through which they were they would have been helped by the community, and some hence really came up, but not enough. It was not enough. So if everybody would have performed his duty, probably this crisis wouldn't have happened. Even today, if we perform our duty properly and do not articulate our rights in the absence of duty, I don't think that there is any problem. Crisis in the life of an individual or in the life of a community is not something which is an exception. It would come every single day. The only point is that we will have to come together, combine our efforts together, put our hands together, and stand together to fight this pandemic. And if we do our duty, I don't think that there would be any trouble as such. But because everybody would keep on articulating rights in the absence of duty, it's like everybody is trying to withdraw from the bank, but nobody is intending to deposit in the bank. So unless you pay in terms of your duty, the right will not be available, because right will flow from a duty well performed. Without performing my duty in the community, if I keep on claiming my rights, this is going to create troubles, and that is precisely the problem that we are facing. So it's a clash of rights rather than a clash of duties as such. Because duties, if you combine, then there won't be any trouble as such. I perform my duty, others' rights are actually taken care of. That's how Hohfeld also talks about it, and that's how the whole world is now coming to realize that rights cannot be talked about in the absence of duties. I had given you 2 examples. One was Valencia Declaration in 1998, and another the UN resolution of 1999, which is a statement of individual responsibilities and duties. That is something we will have to now realize and interpret that.
Okay. Thanks a lot, sir.
Ishad.
I guess this answers his question. Thanks a lot, sir, for joining us. It was really an honor to have you with us, and thanks a lot for sparing time for this session out of your hectic schedule. As you all know, you are having such a hectic schedule, and then also you managed to get approximately half an hour and oh no, 1 hour for us. Thanks a lot, sir. So now,
Okay.
sir.
Yeah, please proceed.
No, sir. Actually, I have to just send the attendance form. So if
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So my role is over.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I can
Thank
take leave from you now.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay,
Sure, sir.
thank you so much. Thank you so much for patient listening and articulating some good questions. We shall keep in touch and you see, keep on exchanging knowledge. है ना? Thank you
Yes,
so
sir.
much. Thank you for
Thanks a lot.
inviting me once again and
It
enabling me
was
to
an
share
honor,
my
Lord.
ideas with you. Thank you so much.
It was an honor, sir. It was pleasure having you with us. Thanks a lot, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Guys, I have sent the attendance form. You may just fill that up for the certificate process. After filling the form, you may just start leaving the meet. Saying message like done. Okay, guys, you may leave if you have filled the registration for the attendance form. Now you may just leave. We will surely send you the certificates through email within 1 week, I guess. 1 or max 2 weeks. By the end of this month, you will get your certificates. Thanks a lot for joining us, guys.